Never in history has a modern military been dismantled with the speed and totality that I am observing in what has happened to Iran's armed forces. Iran had a modern military, a modern navy, a modern air force, modern air defenses, leadership infrastructure, massive hardened bunker complexes built to survive sustained bombardment and to preserve command continuity through the initial phases of any conflict serious enough to threaten them. The investment those facilities represented in engineering, in resources, in decades of strategic planning oriented around the assumption that hardened underground infrastructure could outlast any conventional air campaign has been rendered irrelevant. Never, in the full historical record I have studied across decades of military analysis, has a force of that composition been so rapidly and so completely obliterated. The speed matters as much as the totality. A defeat that unfolds over months allows a government to adapt, to reconstitute, to seek external support, to manage the domestic narrative of what is happening. A defeat that unfolds at the pace I am observing here allows none of those adjustments. It simply ends.
And the reason that outcome became possible begins not with hardware, not with targeting doctrine, not with force ratios, but with a decision made at the level of political authority about what American warfighters are actually permitted to do when they are sent into a fight. The current administration made a choice that previous administrations had declined to make across multiple conflicts and multiple decades of graduated escalation theory. It untied the hands of the people it sent to fight, authorizing them to close with and destroy the enemy as viciously as possible from the first moment of engagement. Not after a warning phase, not after a demonstration of limited force designed to signal resolve while preserving off-ramps, but from moment one. That decision and its operational consequences across every dimension of what I'm about to describe is what I intend to analyze here. At Fort Bragg in North Carolina, the 82nd Airborne Division is preparing to move troops and equipment to the Middle East. The brigade in question numbers approximately 3,000 soldiers and serves as the division ready brigade, the forward element of the immediate response force, whose institutional mission is to deploy anywhere in the world within 18 hours of notification. That 18-hour standard is not an aspiration. It is the operational requirement around which the entire training, equipment, and readiness posture of the Division Ready Brigade is organized. Every exercise, every inspection, every readiness evaluation is ultimately a test of whether that standard can be met under realistic conditions. The order has come in, the clock is running. What I observe in the activity now unfolding across that base is not the improvised urgency of a force responding to surprise. It is the disciplined execution of a deployment sequence that has been rehearsed to the point where the individual steps are performed not from instruction, but from muscle memory accumulated across years of identical preparation cycles. Across the barracks and staging areas, roughly 3,000 paratroopers are packing their gear. Rucksacks are being loaded with clothing, rations, and essentials calculated to sustain the soldier through the initial phase of the deployment before resupply chains are established. M4 rifles are being broken down. The bolt carrier groups wiped clean, the moving parts oiled, the weapons reassembled and function checked. This is not ceremonial maintenance. A weapon that fails in the first engagement because a soldier did not clean it during the preparation phase is a weapon that the force cannot rely on at the moment the force most needs it. Machine gunners are pulling belted ammunition from crates, feeding the linked rounds through their weapons to verify smooth feeding, then coiling the belts and packing them into ammunition cans alongside spare barrels and cleaning kits. By dawn, these soldiers need to be on the aircraft and in the air. That is not a goal, it is a hard constraint. That the entire sequence of activity between now and then is organized to meet And every soldier on that base understands precisely which part of the sequence is theirs to execute and what happens to the broader timeline if their part slips. While the soldiers prepare in the hangars, the airfield is already running a parallel process whose completion must synchronize exactly with the moment the soldiers are ready to board. Ground crews are working on the C-17 Globemaster 3 aircraft lined up on the tarmac. On the ramp, loadmasters are directing forklifts hauling pallets of equipment and military vehicles up the rear cargo ramps into the aircraft bays. Armored trucks, Humvees, and HIMARS rocket launcher vehicles are driven aboard and chained to the cargo deck with the precision that prevents movement during flight without restricting the speed of offloading at the destination. In the cockpits, pilots are powering up the avionics and working through their own pre-flight checks. Navigation systems, radar, flight management computers, everything tested and verified before the first soldier sets foot on the ramp. The two processes, the soldier preparation in the hangars and the aircraft preparation on the tarmac, are running simultaneously and are designed to converge at a single point. The moment the order reaches the hangars and the troops move to their aircraft, that moment arrives. The soldiers grab their bags and personal weapons and file out of the buildings onto the airfield. The C-17S are waiting with their rear ramps down. The soldiers walk toward their assigned aircraft, carrying duffel bags and hard cases with their equipment. At the ramp, they set their bags onto the cargo roller system built into the aircraft floor. Inside the bay, soldiers stack the bags tighter, pushing them together and pulling cargo straps and tie-down cables across the load to lock everything in place, because nothing can shift during a 14-hour flight without creating a problem that cannot be addressed at altitude over open water. Every item loaded onto that aircraft has a place, and every place has a reason grounded in the physics of long-haul military airlift. The soldiers climb aboard and take their seats along the walls and in the center rows. What I observe in the mood inside that aircraft is analytically significant in its own right. The atmosphere is loose. Some soldiers talk to each other, some joke around, some pull out phones for a last look before putting them away. This is not their first deployment, and for most of them, the routine of loading onto a C-17 is as familiar as boarding any other form of mass transport. That familiarity is not indifference to what lies ahead. It is the product of a training and deployment cycle that has conditioned these soldiers to treat the mechanics of movement as unremarkable so that their cognitive and psychological resources remain fully available for what happens after the aircraft lands, rather than being consumed by the process of getting there. A force that arrives psychologically depleted by the stress of transit is a diminished force. A force that arrives having treated the transit as routine is a force that is ready to work the moment the ramp drops. The rear cargo ramp lifts, the upper section of the door folds down and seals against the lower ramp, locking the aircraft shut and pressurizing the cabin. The engines start, all four Pratt and Whitney turbofans spooling up one after another, the sound building from a low mechanical cycling to the sustained roar of a fully powered heavy transport preparing to move. The C-17 taxis out to the runway, lines up, and accelerates. The heavy transport lifts off and climbs into the morning sky. What departs that runway is not simply 3,000 soldiers and their equipment. It is the leading edge of a force projection operation whose full scope only becomes visible when all of its parallel elements are observed together rather than in isolation from one another. 14 hours later, the first C-17 touches down at a military airfield in Qatar. The rear ramp drops the moment the aircraft reaches the unloading area. What follows is not a gradual or methodical unloading sequence managed at the pace of administrative convenience. The offloading begins immediately and proceeds at the speed the operational timeline demands. HIMARS rocket launcher vehicles start their engines, unchained from the cargo deck, and drive down the ramp straight onto the tarmac. They do not stop at the airfield to await further instruction or to complete administrative processing. They drive directly to their assigned firing positions near the border. The targeting data, the fire missions, the coordination with other elements of the force, all of that has been worked out before the aircraft landed so that the vehicles can move from ramp to firing position without pause. Armored vehicles follow behind them. Cargo pallets are pulled off by forklifts. The turnaround is fast. The aircraft that spent 14 hours crossing from North Carolina to Qatar is being emptied and readied for its return, while the equipment it carried is already moving toward its operational position. That speed is not incidental. It is the entire point of deploying the Division Ready Brigade rather than a conventional force on a conventional movement timeline. At the same time, on the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln operating in the region, Marines are loading into helicopters for their own deployment to Qatar. They board Sikorsky MH-60S Nighthawks and V-22 Ospreys parked on the flight deck. Full combat gear, rifles, body armor, packs, ammunition. The helicopters lift off one after another and fly toward the Qatari coast. What I observe in this parallel movement is a deliberate concentration of rapid reaction capability at a single location. A large ground force being positioned close enough to respond immediately if the situation escalates beyond the parameters currently governing the engagement. The strategic logic is straightforward. The force that is already in position does not require the 18-hour deployment window that the Division Ready Brigade requires from Fort Bragg. It requires only the decision to move it, and that decision can be executed in minutes rather than hours. The Marines land in Qatar and move directly to a camp that has already been established by advance teams. Tents are up, perimeters are set, communications are running. The arriving troops drop their gear, receive a quick orientation briefing, and take their positions. The infrastructure into which they arrive was built before they landed by the advance elements whose specific function within the deployment sequence is to ensure that the main body arrives into an environment that is already organized and already secured. That sequencing, advanced preparation, followed by rapid main body insertion, is the operational logic that allows a force to be combat ready within hours of arrival rather than requiring additional days consumed by establishing the basic infrastructure of a forward position from scratch after the main body lands. At the same time, transport ships offshore begin launching amphibious assault vehicles into the water. What I observe in that capability deserves specific analytical attention because it represents a dimension of American power projection that is structurally distinct from the airborne and helicopter-borne elements I have already described. The assault amphibious vehicle is an armored tracked machine that operates both on water and on land. In the water, it is propelled by water jets mounted at the rear of the hull, pushing it through the sea at speeds of up to 8 knots. The hull is sealed and buoyant, keeping the vehicle and the Marines inside it above the surface, regardless of sea state. Once the vehicle reaches the shore, the water jets shut down and it transitions to its tracks, driving up the beach and onto solid ground as a conventional armored personnel carrier. Each vehicle can carry up to 21 Marines with their full gear and is armed with a turret-mounted machine gun and grenade launcher. The capacity to move armored infantry directly from ship to shore without requiring port access, fixed pier infrastructure, or host nation cooperation at the point of entry is the capability that makes amphibious forces strategically distinct from land-based ones. And what I observe being exercised here is that capability at operational scale, not as a demonstration, but as a functional component of the broader force assembly already described. Behind the assault amphibious vehicles, landing craft air cushion vehicles emerge from the transport ships. These are large hovercraft that ride on a cushion of air generated by massive fans mounted at the rear. Each LCAC can carry several trucks, armored vehicles, or up to 60 tons of cargo across the water at speeds exceeding 40 knots. They skim across the surface, spraying seawater behind them, and drive directly up onto the beach without stopping. The ramp drops, and the vehicles inside drive off onto the sand. Humvees, cargo trucks, armored personnel carriers, all delivered straight from ship to shore in minutes. Multiple LCACs make repeated runs between the transport ships and the beach, shuttling vehicles and equipment in successive loads until everything is ashore. What I observe in that sequence is the systematic elimination of the delay that ordinarily separates naval power from land combat power. The ships do not need a port, the vehicles do not need a pier. The force arrives on the beach already organized, already armed, and already oriented toward its assigned position. At the airfield in Qatar, helicopter crews load belt ammunition into the feed trays of their M240 machine guns mounted on the aircraft doors. The belts are inspected link by link, fed through the receiver, and the charging handles pulled back. The guns are hot, the helicopters lift off, and begin flying continuous patrol patterns over the surrounding territory, scanning the sky and ground for Iranian drones. If a Shahed appears on sensors or is spotted visually, the door gunners engage and destroy it before it can reach the troops or the base. The patrols run without interruption, one helicopter returning to refuel and rearm, while another takes its place in the air above the same sector. The perimeter is covered at all times. What that continuous coverage produces is a protected operational environment inside which the assembled force can orient entirely toward its forward mission without allocating internal resources to the drone threat pressing against the perimeter from outside. What I observe across the full arc of what I have described, from the hangars at Fort Bragg to the patrol patterns above Qatar, is not simply a military deployment executed at speed. It is the operational expression of a strategic posture that has been fundamentally recalibrated from constraint to commitment. The 18-hour deployment standard of the Division Ready Brigade, the parallel marine insertion from the Abraham Lincoln, the amphibious offload that bypasses fixed port infrastructure entirely, the continuous helicopter patrols that deny Iranian drone access to the assembled force. Each of these elements reflects a military that has been authorized to operate without the graduated escalation thresholds and self-imposed limitations that governed its engagements across this region for the preceding 2 decades. The historical significance of what I am analyzing here does not reside in the tactical detail of how soldiers pack rucksacks or how loadmasters secure vehicles to cargo decks, though those details matter as evidence of the preparation and discipline the force brings to its mission. It resides in what those details collectively represent about the strategic condition that has produced them. A modern military, Iran's military, with the full range of capabilities that designation implies, and the decades of investment that designation represents, has been defeated rapidly, historically, in a manner that has no precise precedent in the record of modern warfare between organized state militaries operating with comparable equipment and comparable institutional depth. The force now assembling in Qatar is assembling in the aftermath of that defeat, not in anticipation of a contest with an intact adversary capable of contesting the ground it is moving onto.